everyone, I'm Stanley Painter with Court TV, and I've been talking to True Crime Rocket Science.
Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most authentic voice in true crime. It comes up constantly, this impression, this idea that we have no clue how someone like Laurie Vallow, who is of course nothing like us, could do incomprehensible, unfathomable things. And instead of Laurie Vallow, you could put anybody else, Letitia Stork, Brian Laundrie, Chris Watts, etc., etc. Because naturally, none of us, not you nor me, would do or have ever done strange things, right? But this is because we are coming to the story and trying to come into the story at the very end, where all the growing, all the developing, all the changing, all the evolving has already taken place. That whole process has been completed. We're not seeing that process. So no wonder coming right at the end and dealing with the finish line fragment, just that sort of segment, just that piece. No wonder our understanding is small, insignificant, and fragmented as well. So in order to put ourselves in the shoes kind of a true crime case and become comfortable within the true crime psychology, instead of dealing with evidence led in court or autopsy photos, dealing with bruises or red-tinged sputum or some kind of recorded call or conversations or pertinent clues like a fingerprint on black plastic, because all of those are just fragments. What I want to do is take you away from all of that, from the woods of the Vallow case, from the woods of the Letitia Stork case, from the woods of basically all of the cases that we've covered, and ask you to simply think about a tree in human terms, or a human in terms of a tree, a person in terms of a tree. It's really just about changing our perspective to get a different sense, a more global sense of what we're talking about, and also what we feel we don't understand. Remember, Christ himself was crucified on the limbs of what used to be a tree, and a crown of thorns, again from a tree, was placed on his head. Before we get to the rest of this episode, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do. By the way, apologies for not being on YouTube, not putting anything up for a couple of days. I am sort of updating fairly regularly in the community section, and I'm also sometimes updating quite regularly on Instagram. I've also met some of my patrons and followers and mods. Recently spent a couple of days with Terry, who's driven me around. Thanks so much, Terry, for that. And then also Iceland in Oregon. So this episode is really dealing with the Oregon section of my journey, our journey. And of course, right now I'm just inside California. I've actually just crossed over into California again. So if you're enjoying this episode, please like, share, leave a comment. You can also hit the thanks button. And then also on Team Petrie, I'll probably do a little bit of an extended version of my walk through and between and under the redwoods, these magnificent trees, in a separate episode, but quite soon. So look out for that. Okay, so let's get started with this episode. A tree wants to be what all of us want. We want to be able to stretch ourselves out, feel the sunshine, radiate confidence, basically luxuriate in a kind of a living space that we are free to occupy. We want to be able to occupy our own living space in a way that suits us, in a way that's comfortable. And part of that desire to be all that we can be is to cling to the soil that nourishes us, even when that soil is falling away at our feet. So in other words, sometimes we can be really dependent on where we come from, where we're rooted, to such an extent that even when the earth is falling beneath our feet, it's becoming a precipice, we nevertheless try to cling to our roots. We cling to what we know. And that is not so different from the existential drives of moss, ivy, limpets, and barnacles. They find somewhere to thrive, to dig in their heels, to open their eyes and arms to the sun, and they try to deal with others shouldering their way in as well. Even birds will insist on finding their place on a cliff and defending their little hole in the wall, because we want to exist and we want to be allowed to exist on the greatest possible canvas. We want the best possible life for ourselves. And what is wrong with that? Of course we want that. So Ernest Becker, in his book The Denial of Death, Ernest Becker is a Pulitzer Prize-winning author, an American cultural anthropologist. He wrote, "Man cannot endure his own littleness unless he can translate it into meaningfulness on the largest possible level." And when Iceland, Terry and I were walking on a beach, and I think that was just north of, where were we? I think it was Florence in Oregon. We saw some birds nesting on a sort of precarious piece of cliff. And by the way, Terry, I think I've been able to positively identify those birds. They are, as far as I know, those birds are pigeon guillemot, and yeah, so it's a kind of pigeon, I guess. Guillemot is spelled Guillemot, and so they've also got a little bit of white on their shoulders. I actually saw a cockatoo near White House at Crescent City, that's in Northern California, earlier today. So when you're moving through the world, like I've been, like some of us have been lately, when you're fluid, you're exploring, you're open to the unknown, you're moving beyond the corner that you're familiar with, you eventually come upon the biggest and tallest living organisms, the biggest terrestrial creatures on Earth. And what's really interesting is when you investigate this, some of the world's largest land organisms live very close to one another. It's obviously a very good environment. There's enough moisture. There's enough fertile soil. There's sufficient lack of human interference or interference from any other creature. I think it's because it's a relatively not only remote but also mountainous terrain. And so in terms of these excuse me, in terms of these largest organisms, one is in eastern Oregon and the other is in southwestern Oregon, and yet where one, a honey fungus, is massive as a fungal colony carpet with a girth of almost 9 square kilometers, that's somewhere around 2,200 acres. One is like this incredibly wide sort of and widespread colony. The other is just a single tree rocketing upward, an individual who must defend its space in the sun. And that is where I was sort of this afternoon, walking between those giants. In the one case, you're looking upward. In the other case, you've got this incredibly large creature, but it's underfoot. And so it's a difference in scale, it's a difference in perspective, a difference in strategy. But even these may not be the largest creatures on Earth. If you go by mass, if mass is the way you want to determine the largest creature in the world, well, it is the aspen tree, where you've got colonies of clones that can grow up to 8 kilometers or 5 miles long. One of the largest is in Utah. It's a colony, it's called Pando in the Fish Lake National Forest in Utah. Maybe I should go and have a look at that. And then there's something else as well, if you want to talk about also mass. There's a flowering plant that far exceeds Pando as the largest organism on Earth in area, but also mass. And this one is not really a terrestrial plant, and it's not a coral reef either. It's the giant marine plant Posidonia australis. It lives in Shark Bay, Australia. It's about 112 miles long and covers an area of about 77 square miles. That's about 200 square kilometers. It's also among the oldest known clonal plants as well. So can you see, when we see very big creatures, where creatures have managed to colonize and create a vast extent for them to thrive, unopposed, when the efforts of a creature lead to it becoming colossally large or incredibly widespread, I guess, they also tend to live longer because they have achieved the ideal of occupying a space, controlling it, and defending it. Well, once they achieve this, once they can monopolize their living space, they really thrive. They grow tall or spread far and wide, and they are able to live literally for thousands of years. You might say, I don't understand. What does this have to do with Laurie Vallow or Brian Koberger or Chad Daybell or Letitia Stork? What does this have to do with true crime? Well, try and think about it on this very basic level of I want to grow. I want to become as big as I can be. And so for human beings also, the trick in becoming as big as we can be resides in whether one goes it alone. That's one way to achieve that. Maybe Elon Musk has. Maybe Jeff Bezos has. Maybe certain people have. But another way to go about it is by recruiting colonies of soldiers to expand one's influence. You can look at celebrities that achieve that as their strategy. But think about it in true crime as well. Who goes it alone? Koberger, I guess Chris Watts to some extent, who tries to recruit people knowingly or unknowingly. Anyway, if we limit our gaze just to trees, we see that a tree, whether a peach tree or an apple tree, whether a cypress or a willow, they have an inclination to want to be as big as they possibly can, to get as much light as they possibly can on their leaves and on their limbs, and to spread their roots as far into the soil as they can without interference. And so when you see the redwoods, you see that they achieve this by being tall and narrow to some extent compared to the sequoias. They also send out quite small little arms, almost like dinosaurs also can get very big, almost at the expense of their forearms. And so compare that to the sequoias that achieve the same thing by achieving a massive bulk. Look at elephants and whales, they also have a massive bulk. And what they do is they try to maintain that all the way to the uppermost branches, these trees. They try and maintain that bulk. So trees, can you see, they want to be as big as they can be. They want to be as big as they can be. And if they fail to be as big as they can be, another tree that wants to be as big as it can be can actually become kind of a threat. It can actually rob that tree of its shade. And so when you get a road going through the redwood forest, that gap is actually the reason why some of the trees growing next to the road become particularly huge, because they've got a little bit of extra space and no competition, and they can become expansive. So do you see all creatures, whether funguses or fish, reptiles or redwoods, they want to expand into the world. They want to breathe the free air and be allowed to grow. So what's the harm in that? If you say growing is a normal, natural, even instinctual imperative, what's wrong with that? How can that lead to something criminal? How can that lead to terrible things? Where's the seed for any kind of criminal psychology in just wanting to grow? And I think this is where it gets quite interesting. I think you've got to say, well, if all things want to be expansive, it's one thing to say, I want to be expansive. So you look at one tree, that's fine. I want to be expansive. But what happens when there's a tree right next to you that also wants to be, and another tree that also wants to be, and another one, and another one, and another one? Then it's not so much just I want to grow, but I have to grow. Or I have to make sure I'm not pushed into the shade, because that could actually mean either that I'm limited in what I become, or it could actually kill me. It could actually seriously deprive me of what I need. And so if you bring all of this reasoning back to human psychology, when we see ordinary tourists moving through a particular area, do they want average photos of an area? Do they want to sort of take photos of the ordinary stuff? Do people go to sort of make the effort to travel somewhere to in search of the ordinary? Or do they make the effort to go somewhere special to get the best photos of an area? And do they want the okay weather, or do they want the best weather? Do they want the most spectacular this and the most impressive that? Do they want an average experience, or do they want a powerful, inspiring, incredible? Do they want the best experience they can get? So they also, and at the same time, wanting all of that, they also want it to be convenient and not too expensive. It shouldn't come at too great a cost. Of course, some people are less conscious of those things than others. And this is because not only do they want to have and to enjoy the most expansive experience, they also want to prove, this is people, that they have had the most impressive and expansive experience. They've also got to show that. And some people are more interested in showing that than others. So if you take tourists, they look for the most interesting, vivid and varied landscapes in search of a particular pictorial fairy tale. And so does everyone else. We're also looking for that in our lives, in our neighborhoods, in our jobs. We want to live in the best house we can afford with a nice picket fence. So how is it that something so natural, so normal, so innocent can become something so cruel, so abhorrent, so despicable? How can wanting to expand oneself lead to murder? Well, it's when that expansion is either out of proportion or unreasonable or illogical that it's going to affect neighboring creatures or even relatives. In a tree context, one tree threatens another tree simply when it grows too close to it, or when two trees are too close for comfort. You may see how one tree may make moves to block out the light of another tree, and depending on the tree and the situation, even vegetative creatures can become sufficiently broad umbrellas that they starve their neighbors not only of sustenance, but life itself. And all of this silent aggression and wordless strategy is in the name of something seemingly harmless, growth. But growth can be a terrifying prospect if your growth comes at the expense of mine, or if growth means life, and the inability to grow means death. So do you see, in a theoretically harmless mythos that's simply, I want to grow, when one tree needs to be as big as it can possibly be, then other trees become problems. Because what if they want to be as big as they possibly can be as well? What if you can't keep up? And there's your answer to Laurie Vallow. Laurie Vallow isn't a strange, radical new psychology, whether or not you understand her particular symbolic psychology. The reason her growth is so destructive is because it's so completely out of proportion to the living things, that's the people, the family around her, the culture even. She dreams of being and becoming a god, but at the same time, she realizes, she understands, she comprehends, she knows all too well that in order for her to grow into her goddessness, she's going to need resources. She's going to need extra resources. She's going to need additional resources. Well, how's she going to get them? What's she going to need to do to get those resources, to become what she needs to be? And so the zombies around her, like zombie trees, are standing in the way of that expansion. Can you see how simple it is? Put another way, two tourists are traveling together, wanting to see the most they can see. But one tourist thinks this way is better, and that one thinks, well, a different pace or a different approach makes more sense. One wants to spend more money, one wants to spend less money. One wants to spend more time, the other one wants to spend less time. And you see how that simple thing, well, I also want to grow, I want to see. Both people actually want to do the same thing, but the one becomes a threat to the other simply through the lens of expansion. And we saw that with Gabby Petito. Someone who just in a traveling dynamic wanted to experience things a certain way and the other person in a different way. They both want to experience something. It's just their approach is different. but they're both trying to grow and they're both trying to expand. And in a way, it can be the one's growth can be a threat to the other one. So make no mistake, even little expansions grate at another creature when it comes at the cost of their own. In other words, if Gabby's doing something Brian doesn't want to do, or if Brian's doing something Gabby doesn't want to do, it's coming at the cost of someone, unless they can deal with that. Letitia Stork, in some way, felt a little boy was limiting her ability to live, to love, to be. It's like kind of a tree that is getting a bit concerned about a smaller shrub at its feet. And maybe to some extent she was right. Maybe she was being limited. But maybe her expectations of the sort of expanded, larger-than-life lifestyle that she wanted were also unreasonable. So it's okay to want to grow. The question is, are your expectations reasonable? If they're not, they can be a threat to someone else. They can even be a threat to you. Gabby Petito, although she's the victim of her own story, was clearly trying to expand herself on the largest possible canvas. If you're not sure what that means, just go back and look at her social media. I've actually found a hole inside a big face of rock that made me think of Gabby Petito. The trouble was with Gabby Petito, and it's not her fault, I'm certainly not victim blaming. The trouble was in that dynamic. She was expanding more than he was. And I think in ways that he began to interpret as a threat to himself. So can you see, even if you love someone, their expansion, even if it's not controlled, is a threat. Their expansion relative to your own can be a threat. Just that. Just growing, vis-a-vis someone else growing or not growing, that can be a threat. So what is the antidote to all this? Well, I think it's to try to be reasonable in one's expansiveness. So if you're saying, we see this criminal psychology of unreasonable, an unreasonable expectation for growth and for being something, is particularly Laurie Vallow. So what's the antidote? How can we not be like that? Well, to be reasonable in our expansiveness, to try to be rational in how much and perhaps how quickly one intends to increase one's influence. In the end, it's all about agency. How much do we have? How much do we demand? And how much is realistic? When you're impaired, perhaps due to a long winter, this is talking about trees, or in Gabby and Brian's case, COVID, they did what they did because of that, or sleep deprivation or not having enough money, or ordinary anxiety. But in any event, if you're impaired, a simple problem can be a large obstacle. It can feel insurmountable. You kind of got that idea with Gabby and Brian. That small obstacle was not really having enough money and having this very big dream about driving around. And I can tell you it's pretty expensive. In Letitia's case, she had also an expectation, and she had a simple problem. And that was Gannon. And she was impaired in some way because she couldn't figure a way out of that, right? In Gabby Petito's case, it's also a problem of anxiety. It's a simple problem becoming a very large obstacle, ultimately insurmountable. And yet, if you take Laurie Vallow, Letitia Stork, and Gabby Petito, and you say, were they really in an impossible situation? Because actually, they weren't. This is quite a simple problem. And the way to solve it, all it required was a change in perspective. So let me give you a personal example of a change in perspective, a change in context, a change in a situation. On the night that I left Boise, on my very last night that I was there, it was Wednesday going into Thursday, on the night that I flew to Seattle, it was very late, I was very tired, and I kind of wanted to do some work. But I somehow locked my phone out of my laptop. I did what I've done before. The only difference was that in an effort to try and create additional memory, I made quite a big transfer of files from my phone to an external hard drive. And somewhere in the middle of that process, an error occurred and basically the laptop kicked the phone off the system. And so I spent many hours that night, many sleepless hours trying to troubleshoot and problem solve, and I ultimately failed. I couldn't figure out what was wrong. I Googled potential solutions. I tried lots of different things, updating drivers and using different cables. But the real problem was that my mind was so numbed with fatigue that I could actually barely function. And so with 1 hour's sleep, I was effectively a zombie when I got onto the plane. And then on a totally different day, in a totally different context, a couple of days later, having rested, having, become more functional, when I dealt with the same problem again, I figured it out and solved the problem within about 5 minutes. So, it was quite simple. It wasn't very hard to figure out. Something that had taken hours to try and decipher when I was impaired took 5 minutes when I wasn't. And so can you see, sometimes we cling to our expectations when we're on the wrong side of the resources that we have. And other times, we have simple problems and have the energy and alacrity to solve them. And so you sometimes see trees that cling to the edge of these cliffs, and they are insisting on just continuing to do what they're doing. And you can understand a tree doing that, but a person doesn't need to do that. A person that's been rooted to a particular situation can uproot itself, adapt, move somewhere else, and, develop a better situation, better resources than clinging to the situation that a person is in. So if you think about Laurie, Letitia, and Gabby Petito, all three of them heading out into their doomed adventures in some way, well, ultimately, none of them possessed actual agency, if you think about it. None of them possessed real resources to achieve what they wanted. Laurie cheated that whole thing of, but you don't have enough to do what you want to do. Well, she cheated that by trying to harness the resources of a colony. For example, insurance agencies and cult people who would start to do what she asked them to do. Letitia cheated by trying to dodge some of the slings and arrows that come from wifehood and motherhood. And Gabby, I think she simply underestimated the cost of dreaming big, not only in terms of herself, but the teetering, trembling house of cards that she was traveling with. So to conclude, people don't want to be put into a hole, just as trees refuse to fall into the abyss when the earth gives way beneath their toes. But how we get out of it, depends on our capacity to grow sustainably. That means at a pace that reality can stand, at a pace that our neighbors can tolerate, can stand. And if we can find a place, so like if you take Gabby Petito, she wanted to grow at a pace that Brian Laundrie couldn't stand. And so one's got to at least be aware of that. I'm not saying you've got to cower and sort of, allow someone else to control you, but you've also got to be aware that people out there may not like the pace at which you are changing. It could be family members. And so you've got to also work out, does that pace work for everybody? And if not, should you go somewhere else, right? So if we can find a place where we are allowed to be who we are for any length of time, then yes, we can grow and grow and grow, and perhaps one day become giants. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you guys next time.